Hello and welcome to our podcast episode. My name is David.
And my name is Markéta.
And this episode is our semester project for the Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation course taught by Dr. Smetana. In this episode, we will talk about gender and nuclear weapons. The podcast will be divided in two parts. In the first part, we will introduce the connection between the concept of gender and nuclear security. And in the second part, we will follow with a conversation with Cheryl Rofer, as someone who knows more about the issue than we do. Our introductory part will touch upon two different but connected issues. The first being the ideas about gender, and the second one could be broadly labeled as women's issues, or the relations of women to nuclear weapons and nuclear security in a broader sense. First, before elaborating on the connection between gender and nuclear weapons, we need to speak about what actually the concept of gender means. Gender is a concept that is often misused and misunderstood, and has multiple meanings as well. It is usually employed to make a distinction between biology and culture, where on the one hand, there are biological differences between different bodies, and then there are cultural meanings of these differences. These meanings include claims about what traits are considered masculine and feminine, what kinds of characteristics we expect women or men to have, or the kinds of social roles we think it is appropriate for them to take on. It is about what it means to be a real man or a good woman.
So gender is, however, not only about personal identities, it is also about the power dynamics that these claims invoke and that they help to sustain. And these power dynamics translate from the personal sphere to the political and the social spheres as well. So then the traits that we traditionally associate with masculinity, such as rationality, responsibility, objectiveness, or strength, make it appear as somehow natural that men are usually in a more powerful position than women. Whereas on the other hand, for women who have been seen more as emotional, irrational, passive, or weak, it then might appear as natural to stay at home and take care of the family lives. Now, the next thing to do when we are thinking about gender is to realize that its effects actually go beyond the meanings that are ascribed to different male and female bodies, and also beyond the unequal ways that power is distributed amongst men and women. And this applies because gender also functions as a sort of symbolic system. And this symbolic system is based on different binaries that are often imagined in opposition to each other. And here we can mention cases such as strong versus weak, or active versus passive, rational versus irrational, or realistic versus idealistic, and many more such as that. So then in these pairings, the masculine side of the pair is often valued more highly than the feminine one, or at least in the very dominant gender discourse. And the system of codes is then reflected in many other different spheres of life. And this is actually how our ideas about gender are shaping also our ideas about many other different aspects of society that lie beyond the sole male and female relations. For example, this is how our ideas about politics, warfare, or weapons are also shaped. So then the main argument here is that our ideas about gender have a very significant effect on the formation of the discourses, be it political, expert, or media discourses that have been sort of developed to think about nuclear weapons. And in fact, our ideas about gender also affect the very basic reality of what we imagine when we talk about security. And in this way, the word security itself, and especially if we talk about national security in here, it has been sort of taken by the realist perspective and made to be mostly connected to ideas about military budgets. And as such, it makes states invest a crazy amount of money to modernize their nuclear or conventional arsenals instead of putting this money in maybe these decent healthcare or social systems or education. And the states do that in the name of national security, because the dominant realist idea is that more weapons equal more security.
Now, this also connects to our idea about who is to be made secure. And traditionally, this referent object was the state. And in this regard, nuclear weapons can indeed be seen as security guarantors, at least to the extent we trust in deterrence to work. More recently, however, we've seen a shift from state-oriented security towards the so-called human security. And within the human security paradigm, we start to care more about societies, communities, and individual human beings who are now in the center of attention as the receivers of security. Such a shift in perception changes a lot. It allows us to imagine and take into account the consequences that will follow a potential nuclear use, but also the consequences that are already present in our world and that have affected many communities subjected to nuclear testing or uranium mining. As just such, the shift towards human security can make us realize the immorality of nuclear weapons by making us ask who the presumed security is for, who actually benefits from it, and using gender as lens can help us in uncovering some of these power dynamics. This issue of gendered ideas about nuclear security, however, is different from the actual relations that men and women have to nuclear weapons. The latter is about the unequal participation in the decision-making processes versus unequal distribution of harms. The fields of nuclear security and policy have long been a men's discipline, as men and women comprise approximately 50% of the world's population. This means that we often miss half of the picture if women are not present. It also means that women are not equally engaged in nuclear policy decisions as in any other discussion that affects their lives. For example, in the first committee of the United Nations that deals with disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control issues, women constitute only 32% of all delegates, the smallest proportion among all UN committees. Or in the US, according to data collected from 1970 until 2019, the total number of women that have held a leadership position at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency is 13 from a total of 109 persons. And this is just a small part of the larger picture of the general and global underrepresentation of women in high politics. According to the data of the United Nations, as of January 2021, women account for only 21.9% of ministers globally. Or for example, in 2020, women served as heads of state or government in 22 countries worldwide.
And while women have often been absent from the decision-making processes regarding nuclear weapons, the potential impact of radiation on their bodies is believed to be different from that of male bodies. Scientists have actually found that women are more at risk of developing fatal cancer than men when exposed to the same amount of radiation exposure. And women's reproductive health is especially susceptible to it. So, for example, there was a National Cancer Institute study which documented the women who lived downwind from nuclear testing sites at Pacific Islands and who had high rates of stillbirths and some babies born without bones or with other severe deformities, such as transparent skin or displaced organs. And still, women's voices are often being disregarded. And in this regard, where we have seen at least some positive development is that today we're seeing more and more effort on gender mainstreaming. That is that many organizations are putting more and more effort in bringing women's voices in discussions. They're aiming at a more equitable representation, considering different perspectives, but also attempting at encouraging women to seek a career in the field and changing the broader narratives of who can make a career where, as well as being more inclusive in this regard. And here it is very important to note that women were actually central to the anti-nuclear weapon protests ever since the beginning of the nuclear age. And these protests, in turn, help to shape the current global disarmament infrastructure, but also to better understand the linkage that is here between gender and disarmament. So women's organizations have protested against nuclear weapons ever since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they have also, for example, campaigned for a ban of nuclear testing. For instance, when women activists collected baby teeth and had them tested for levels of strontium-19, it had a very strong impact on the public debate on nuclear weapons in the United States. Women anti-nuclear activists have also successfully closed different nuclear weapons bases, such as the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in the United Kingdom. Women have also engaged in efforts that have helped to force governments to change their policies, or for example, to create nuclear weapon-free zones throughout the world. Women have also monitored and lobbied international meetings on disarmament, such as, for example, the Chemical Weapons Convention or the CTBT.
The work conferences on women in 1975, 1980, 1985 and 1995 all mentioned disarmament because of the advocacy done by women's organizations that work to expose the linkages between gender issues and weapons issues. The 1995 Beijing Declaration recognized the leading role that women have played in the peace movement, working actively towards general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control and supporting negotiations on the conclusion without delay of a universal and multilaterally and effectively verifiable comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, which contributes to nuclear disarmament and the prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons in all aspects. As a very recent example, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, which entered into force in January 2021, is the first treaty to recognize the underrepresentation of women in decision-making about nuclear weapons. Its preamble states that the commitment of the signatory parties to the participation of women in nuclear disarmament. The treaty also recognized that the equal participation of both women and men is an essential for the promotion and attainment of sustainable peace and security. This recognition and commitment is highly important for promoting, because it means that actually there is a need for change, but also helps to create a functional framework for renewing the progress in equal representation at future meetings of the signatories. We could argue, however, that while the equal representation of men and women in such matters is crucial, what is even more important is something we could call equality of ideas. Because obviously, if we look at international politics, we see that ideas about the need for more weapons to stay protected from any non-peace-loving nation or the irrational other are still valued more highly than ideas about how to collectively pursue a world where mutual cooperation and inclusion will be the guiding principles instead.
So now is a good moment to move back to the more abstract dimension of gendered ideas and their effect on nuclear policy. So we were already talking about how gender is a symbolic system. And this is actually the spot where it connects with nuclear weapons. And it is because these weapons are not only physical objects, but their function is also political and symbolic. And as such, their symbolic importance is key in the national and international security debates, but also in domestic politics. As such, they can grant not only power and leverage in the global arena, but also a status of a modern, industrial, and developed state that just has to be counted with. And as such, nuclear weapons have been coded as symbols of power, strength, and modernity, which makes them to seem as a guarantee of the state's security, but also as an admission to the very elite club of powerful states. And actually, on a similar note, they can function as a source of legitimacy in front of the domestic audiences in the different states. And here, of course, we need to mention Carol Cohn, who is the author that have made it very clear that nuclear weapons have ever since their creation been connected to a sort of sense of masculinity. And she spotted this connection through an examination of what she called the technostrategic language that is employed by nuclear defense intellectuals. And she found that their language is full of abstraction or euphemisms that somehow help to remove oneself from the very reality of nuclear destruction or the actual suffering of human beings. So then the security experts use terms like clean strikes, clean bombs, limited nuclear strike, or collateral damage, rather than killing, human death, or nuclear holocaust, which is actually what lies behind these words. And within such discourse, there is no place for emotion. And when someone brings concern about the fragility of human bodies, for example, it is then very easy to dismiss this person as emotional, as opposed to someone who is rational. And similarly, within the dominant gendered security discourse, it is very easy to label someone as idealistic in opposition to someone who is realistic. And by that, it is easy just to discredit their position. And this is important to note and to think about, because in order to address the nuclear challenges of the current era in a more effective manner, it is really essential to take into consideration how our armament and disarmament policies and different practices have been influenced by these ideas about masculinity. And an understanding of this influence can play a very crucial role in breaking some of the persistent barriers that are stopping us from achieving disarmament and non-proliferation. This is because full and complete nuclear disarmament might seem like a very silly and unrealistic goal when we look at it from the perspective of the patriarchal realist discourse. And what this effectively means is that the proponents of disarmament are very often being dismissed as irrational or emotional. And then someone who proposes that rather than focusing on more extensive armament policies, we should maybe negotiate a treaty, or that we should be actually thinking about the people who are at the end of our strategic equations, and also the nasty consequences that they would have to face. Well, that person could be very easily dismissed as someone who is wimpish or weak. And by these very mechanisms, the existing power relations that are present in the current nuclear order are effectively being perpetuated.
Now, we might ask, what are the concrete, real-life examples of gendered ideas affecting nuclear policy? One good case worth mentioning are the reactions of nuclear weapon states to the TPNW, which were totally expectable, but at the same time show the gendered rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons and its connection to power relations. We were already mentioning the ban treaty before, so the treaty is a result of the humanitarian initiative which sought to challenge the dominant state-centered view of security, and by that to undermine the perceived legitimacy of possession of nuclear weapons. The ban was from the beginning promoted through the empowerment of women and activists from the global south as a collective effort of civil society and diplomatic actors. The initiative, however, has faced strong opposition from the most militarily and economically influential states in the world, understandably so, as it aimed at deconstructing some of the rigid power structures that are present in international politics. A gendered rhetoric of these structures is often employed to obscure the perspective of those who might seek to challenge them. And so obviously, in opposition to the TPNW, the nuclear haves argued that the non-nuclear states don't really understand how security works, that they are emotional, irrational, and that their propositions are destabilizing to the international security. The representatives of the nuclear haves, called the proponents of the ban, radical dreamers, who have shot off to some other planet or even outer space, and suggested that even taking into account the humanitarian perspective is emotional. Or, for example, the Russian delegation to the UN argued that even children know what a nuclear weapon does and that time should not be wasted on such useless topics.
This is actually also a very good example of how the whole nuclear order is to such a large extent structured as patriarchal. So under the NPT, we have the 5 official nuclear halves, and even though on paper their position should be equal to the nuclear have-nots, in reality, what we see is that the power relations work quite differently, and that the voice of the nuclear have-nots just does not have the same weight. And it also shows how the very binary comparisons and contrasts, such as strength versus weakness or reason versus emotions, are gendered. And in this gendered symbolic system, the strength and reason are associated with masculinity, and emotion, on the other hand, with femininity. And another clear example that we can mention here is the way that non-Western nuclear states have been portrayed by different politicians, but also in the media. And especially, this applies especially to Kim Jong-un, who we have seen being portrayed as a teenager with nukes, who is presumably super irrational, crazy, insane, unpredictable. And as such, he is often being infantilized and portrayed as incapable, while at the same time, he is seen as someone who is very dangerous and merciless in attempting to grasp all the power that he can and to threaten the West with it. And this then also translates to the country as a whole, which in the case of North Korea means that it is at the same time believed that their weapon systems are much less capable than what we have in the West, while at the same time, North Korea is often being perceived as a state whose systems could destroy us within minutes, or that they're seen as holding us hostage with their nukes, etc., etc. And this actually is dangerous because it can result in some very dangerous assumptions about what kind of policy best suits these conditions. For example, that it just might be better to nuke North Korea first before it is able to do something crazy. And so to wrap this part up, we have seen how the ideas about gender do not apply only to our personal lives, but also to high politics. And nuclear weapons are a very good example of that. So now we will follow with our discussion with Cheryl Rofer, where we unpack some of these thoughts further.
Welcome everyone to our podcast. Today we are joined by Ms. Rofer, who is a retired nuclear scientist with an impressive 35-year career during which she worked not only on decommissioning and disassembling nuclear and chemical weapons, but also on projects dealing with environmental cleanup at Los Alamos, Estonia and Kazakhstan. Currently, she is actively writing on the US national security and different topics in science, but also on women's issues mainly, but not only on blogs, the Nuclear Diner and Lawyers, Guns and Money.
Hi, Cheryl, and welcome to our podcast episode. We're super happy to have you here.
Good morning, Markéta and David. It's nice to be here.
So the reason why I thought that you would be an ideal guest for our episode is because you've been vocal about the usage of gendered language by US policymakers, and especially under Trump's administration and in relation to third countries such as North Korea. And also, importantly, I knew about your Adventures in Masculinity thread on Twitter, in which, as I understood it, you want to bring attention to how much our gender tropes present in both our daily lives, such as in the media, but also importantly in foreign policy talk. So my first question is, could you explain for us and for our listeners, what do you mean by the Adventures in Masculinity, or what you also, in other words, called Superfluous Masculinity? And what has led you to dedicate a thread like that to the phenomenon in the first place?
Well, what I wanted to do with that, and I'm not entirely happy with the title, but that was what I came up with at the time, so I'm kind of stuck with it. The reason I thought about superfluous masculinity is that it was masculinity coming into discussions where it wasn't needed. And what I wanted to do with the thread was not so much beat up on people who are just, kind of strutting all over the place with masculinity, this, that, and the other thing, but to show places where we might not notice it, but masculinity is a theme and that it is coming into play, even though we don't think about it, because our society is so saturated with tropes of masculinity, particularly in foreign policy.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Now, what is then your view on the most problematic impact of using gendered tropes in the practice of foreign policy making, particularly in nuclear policy?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Oh yes. What is your view on the most problematic impact of using gendered tropes in the nuclear policies or nuclear field policies?
Yeah, it's hard to say the most problematic impact, because foreign policy originated in the late 19th century, early 20th century, mostly in respect to colonialism and the dominant nations like Great Britain and later the United States and how they dealt with their colonies. So there's a male centrism and white male centrism in particular built into the entire field, and that has persisted and persists through today.
Yes, thank you. So now more on a personal note, can you think of a case from your own personal experience where this gendered dynamic has affected you and your work? Because I was thinking that these occurrences that are present in the global or domestic political discourses, they are somewhat more visible to us. So it would be really interesting for me to hear whether also the daily sort of invisible practices that are related to nuclear weaponry are also affected by this gender dynamic.
Oh, there's many examples in my life. The first job I applied for, the response I got was, you were the best applicant for the job, but the man you'd be working with can't see working with a woman.
Oh, wow.
That was back in 1964 when people were pretty open about such things. And today I have had difficulties getting articles published because I have added some feminist type analysis to what I'm saying about foreign policy. And it was kind of interesting because I had experiences with two very different editors on two very different articles, very close to each other, within 6 months of each other. And the editors went through the same kinds of objections. The parallel was really remarkable. And I think it was because they just couldn't get their minds around what I was doing in the analysis.
Yeah, I feel like these topics are still a lot like outside of the mainstream.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so I understand
it
must be problematic for you.
Well, I hope to have more to say about that in the coming year or so.
Mm-hmm. Do you plan on writing more like foreign policy stuff out of feminist perspectives?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
We're looking forward to that.
We certainly are. And you mentioned the white male centrism in the foreign policy. You've been particularly critical of Trump administration for presenting itself and behaving as highly masculinized and patriarchal. We have seen many arms control frameworks being torn down during this period, while symbolically being presented as something weak in contrast with a greater extent of nuclear buildup and modernization depicted as something more rational. Do you think the tropes of masculinity were at the core of these decisions, or were they more of a justification for the Republican audience?
Well, maybe all of the above, maybe a little bit of everything there. Trump was quite explicitly masculinist. I mean, the most notable example was when he told Kim Jong-un that his button was bigger and more powerful. Yeah, I think we know what he was talking about there. I mean, that was pretty crude, to be honest, and it was pretty bad. But there has been a real leaning towards military action as an answer to problems with other countries. I think this grew up during the 90s because the United States was the only really active superpower, and people who are in policy-making positions now were coming of age, so to speak, in the 90s, and the United States could just push its way around the world. Diplomacy is seen as something that is feminized. It's just really easy to take up the feeling of real men go to war and don't talk about stuff. So we need to back off from that and start looking at all sorts of approaches to calming down volatile situations. President Biden is talking to President Putin right now, I think, even as we speak. And hopefully they will find something other than war as an answer. I think this is something that a more feminized foreign policy and feminized analysis of foreign policy can bring to the table, is opening up more options for ways of solving conflicts.
Right, yeah, most certainly.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well, because I feel like we're getting to this point of view where initiatives like arms control and disarmament are, from the hawkish point of view, they are labeled as something, you know, not rational or idealistic, naive. So yeah, hopefully there's a way to overcome this.
Well, if I may, just a bit of a follow-up question on that. During the Obama administration, a large part of the foreign policy was done by Vice President Biden, and now when there is Kamala Harris as the Vice President of the United States, foreign policy seems to be rather Mr. Biden's job than Ms. Kamala's. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, President Biden, when he was Senator Biden, was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was very active in dealing with treaties and nuclear issues. So he's quite knowledgeable on those issues, and he also has strong feelings about them. I was the president of an arms control group in Los Alamos when he was in the Foreign Relations Committee. And so I followed what he was doing rather carefully. He was quite active, although his name doesn't appear on the legislation, in the Nunn-Lugar activities in the former Soviet Union during the 1990s. He supported those strongly. He made a number of trips to Russia and some of the other states. So this is really his topic. And he has given some foreign policy responsibilities to Vice President Harris. She is working with Central America on the refugee issues that we have on the southern border. So he's bringing her up in these issues, but it's hard to see Joe Biden giving up foreign policy and nuclear issues entirely.
So you could say it's Mr. Biden's forte, more or less.
It really is.
Yeah, thank you. I have a follow-up question for that. So during your experience at the Los Alamos Arms Control Group, has the feminist or more like gender-friendly perspectives been brought up, or was it more of an implicit thing?
It was, the group is not very active now, and I would say it was most active in the 1990s and early 2000s. It was kind of a delightful group to be in because some of the older people in it had been around and had urged the development of some of the treaties. Like one of the people had been instrumental in developing the Open Skies Treaty, which was one of the treaties that Trump trashed. So I have always felt particularly favorable to the Open Skies Treaty. And it was a great treaty because it allowed nations to interact with each other, to set up ways of seeing into what the other was doing. And it was transparency and working together, which is a big part of most treaties.
Yeah, thank you. So my next question is also related to what you've been talking about now. And it's whether you have noticed a significant positive shift with the Biden administration, or is this like gender symbolism where more nuclear weapons equate to more power and therefore more security, just a little bit more hidden than before? Or in other words, do you think that there's still an element of continuity with the Trump administration present?
Well, there's always an element of continuity because a great many people in the government remain the same through different administrations. It's the people at the top who get changed around. And right now, the administration is putting together its nuclear posture review, and there's evidently been some reaction on that, which is a little bit hard to see into from the outside, so I can't say a whole lot on what's going on there. As far as gender goes, some of the reactions to what we've been learning about the Chinese nuclear program have been just knee-jerk, well, if they're getting more nuclear weapons, we need more nuclear weapons, which is kind of silly when you consider that we have 1,400 nuclear weapons deployed, and the Chinese have maybe 300. So we've got 3-4 times what they have, maybe more. It is disturbing that the Chinese are building up their nuclear force. I won't go into that in great detail, but one of the things I noticed in some of the work I've been doing lately is I read the nuclear posture review from the Obama administration and the one from the Trump administration. And while gender is not obvious in it, the emphases in the two are quite different, as is the wording. I think if I went through a word by word analysis, I could probably find some gender relations or emphasis or references even, but the Obama nuclear posture review really downplayed nuclear weapons as a part of the United States defense. They are mainly for deterrence, or at worst, in a very extreme situation, whereas the Trump nuclear posture review was much more active in looking at them as a part of the military's tools and one more tool that might be used someday.
Yeah, that actually sounds like a pretty interesting project to compare the two nuclear posture reviews out of a feminist discourse analysis. Could be fun to do.
Interesting. Like I say, I didn't look at them in that much detail, but even looking at them less closely, I was surprised at how different they were. And I would expect the Biden nuclear posture review to look a lot more like the Obama nuclear posture.
That's what I was about to ask. What are your hopes for the new nuclear posture review? Because in the Trump's one, there has been some pretty nonsensical parts, such as about the escalate to de-escalate in Russia's strategy and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a little hard to say because there is this controversy going on within the government about how the review will be written. And another factor, I think, is that Biden's primary attention is on the economy and getting the pandemic under control. So in a way, the nuclear posture review doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Clearly, I'd rather see something that looks more like the Obama review. I don't have a strong feeling about a statement of no first use or sole use. In a way, it is just words on paper, but on the other hand, those words do tell you something about how the administration sees nuclear weapons and what they want, how they want them to be a part of our military system.
Yes, definitely.
Right. So in recent years, there's been a rise in initiatives aiming at gender mainstreaming and equal participation of women in the field of security. Do you think that actual change in thinking about nuclear weapons, meaning depriving them of their symbolic importance, can be reached through these initiatives?
I think those initiatives are important. I think they are a good thing. But part of it depends on how people think, whether they are men or women. So you could get women in and they would be socialized into the male view of the military, and they could be just as hawkish as any man. So the simple fact of femaleness is not the whole story. And but I think having women on these various decisional bodies and in Congress, in the military, I think that is important in many ways. I think many women do bring different perspectives. And I think just seeing different sorts of people in these institutions makes a difference in how we all think.
That is true. It's always important to bring in some new perspectives.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of this is actually about different perspectives on security itself, where on the one hand, security can mean in the heads of some more weapons and more defense and a larger defense budget. But on the other hand, this just doesn't look at the whole question, where there is like stuff like social security, welfare, and education.
Right. I think that security is a whole web of things. And I think the pandemic is particularly bringing that home to all of us. We've been careless about our health system, and we are paying for it with the pandemic lasting longer than it might have. So yes, there's a great deal involved in security. We have this democracy Congress coming up. I can't remember the exact name. And there are people who are saying, well, you know, maybe the United States needs to look at itself relative to democracy and relative to how we take care of our people. And I think that's a legitimate comment. So yeah, I would say security includes a great many things besides bombs and guns.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, totally. There's still a lot more to do in this regard. But I would like to ask whether over your career, have you seen a positive shift towards what we could call demasculinization of the US foreign policy and nuclear security in general? This, yeah, we have also already talked about this a little bit. So I was thinking maybe it's more of a cyclical loop that goes as the administrations change. As in, we can see some progress maybe when the Democrats are in power, but then somebody like Trump comes and we're back to this trigger-happy, gendered, and racialized LeMay model of thinking. And once again, we're depicting rival statesmen as teenagers with nukes.
Well, we have a relatively recent phenomenon in the United States over the past 20 or 30 years in which the Republican Party wants to tear down everything that the Democratic Party does. And they see themselves primarily in opposition to any kind of governance, but very much for a strong military. So in the past, if you go back to the 1960s or 1970s, you'll see a lot more continuity from one administration to another. And we need to get back to something like that, because if we're just going to flop from one thing to another with presidential administrations, that's not good for us and it's not good for the world.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe a nuclear crisis would have to happen to sort of bring everybody to the table and say, yeah, okay, now we actually need to engage more in arms control? Because I was thinking that some of the most important treaties came out of the Reagan's administration in the 1990s.
Yeah, what's interesting is that most of our arms control agreements have actually been completed under Republican presidents. And there's an argument that Republican presidents look strong, so they don't look like they're giving up too much with arms control, whereas Democratic presidents are tarred with being weak. Although if you actually look back to people like Lyndon Johnson, it's hard to think of him as being weak. And therefore it's harder for them to do. I'm not sure how true that is, but the fact is that it has been mostly Republican presidents who've completed arms control agreements. But now we've had George W. Bush and Donald Trump tearing up arms control agreements. And the last big agreement was New START under Obama. So I'm not sure how much that holds anymore. And I think I'm kind of trailing off from what your question actually was. Do you want to give me your question again?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether there must be a nuclear crisis to actually bring everybody to the table.
Boy, I hope not. Nuclear crises are very scary. I've been looking at the development of nuclear strategy through the 1950s, and the early 1960s were really a crisis point in many ways. We had these new weapons and really had a hard time figuring out how to use them through the 1950s. I would almost say at this point that we were just stumbling through it, and we're kind of lucky that we're all still here. But in the early 1960s, there was a crisis over Berlin, which was inside East Germany at the time, and Khrushchev was going to cut off access to it. And one of the options that came up was nuclear war. People were much more willing back then to think about nuclear war as a real possibility. And the study that came up said there'd be anywhere from 2 to 15 million Americans killed, which kind of shocked John Kennedy and his government. And they realized, and then of course there was the Cuban Missile Crisis a year or so after that. So I don't think that that kind of crisis is good. I think that fundamentally most nuclear nations understand that using those weapons means the end for all of us, and therefore don't want to use them. Now, if we could actually say that in public, if the nations could say that in public, and if they could get together on it, we might be on the way to dealing with nuclear weapons. I'd rather see that route than some sort of nuclear crisis.
Yes, I feel like
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
that the phenomenon of luck actually is so underappreciated. I feel like it's not talked about enough.
Luck has played a big part in keeping us here on this planet.
Yes, I think so too.
Well, speaking of luck, I'm not sure if you know, but the Minuteman missile silos are still controlled by the equipment which is from the 70s. So there is a computer which was put in there in the 70s, and it's still able to launch the missile, but hasn't been upgraded since. Now, how do you think it's a good idea? How does that make you feel when almost 40-year-old equipment is controlling the fate of the humanity?
Well, without knowing exactly what the computers are, you can argue that, for instance, floppy disks are more secure than being connected to the internet. So I'm not sure that the age of the equipment, as long as it is kept in proper working order, is necessarily the issue. I think the fact of the missiles is an issue, and what I'm seeing from looking at nuclear strategy in the 1950s is that there's really only one nuclear strategy, and that is shoot them all off at once, and before the other guy can shoot them off. Now, we've elaborated on that in many ways, and we do have nuclear submarines, both the Russians and we have submarines with nuclear warheads as a second strike. But the fact is, we can go to what Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev said, which was a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. That's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, so I think Albert Einstein also had a great quote. He said, I think in the Third World War, I don't know what the weapons are going to be, but I know that in the Fourth, that it's going to be rocks and sticks.
Right.
Yes, I would like to address what you hinted on before, because yes, there's this common sense that to use these weapons would mean the complete destruction of the earth, so we don't want to do that. And yet the discourse is so very often that there's this crazy Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin or whoever is currently in the news, and yes, they are going to use them, while the United States is still perceived as the responsible actor. But we have seen a lot of talk about this issue, particularly with the Trump administration at the end of his presidency, where it was not quite sure if he was mentally stable, and he's the sole authority to use nuclear weapons, of course. So do you think that changing this sole authority would be a way to go?
Well, what you're detailing there is a good reason not to have nuclear weapons around where people can access them in extremely dangerous ways. So that's kind of where I'd go to on that, is this is another reason that we should all be working together to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I know that you have been also addressing the issue of nuclear terrorism. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Whether you perceive that these dangers are currently real?
I think nuclear terrorism is something that we need to be aware of. The primary fact, though, about nuclear weapons is that they need enriched uranium or plutonium in order to be nuclear weapons. And both of those substances are really hard to obtain. The United Nations puts out a report every year about trafficking that might be in enriched uranium or plutonium. And it's always been very small amounts, if anything at all. Frequently, what is sold is presented as enriched uranium or plutonium, but in fact, it's something else. So as long as we can control those substances, and we do, the nations that have them, even when the Soviet Union broke up, probably the closest that we came to people getting a hold of plutonium was in Kazakhstan, where the Soviets had done tests, explosive tests with plutonium, and just left the plutonium there. So it was quite accessible. There were people who were scavenging metals at the nuclear test site there, and they came pretty close to the areas that had plutonium in them. But the United States, Russia, and Kazakhstan worked together to clean that up. They got 100 kilograms of metallic plutonium and concreted over areas, made sure that nobody's going to get anything that might have been left there. So I think that a dirty bomb using perhaps a hospital source of cesium-137 is much more likely than actual nuclear terrorism.
Yes, thank you. That's super interesting.
Yes, and what sort of scale are we talking when it comes to these dirty bombs? I suppose it relates to the size of the material that's that's about to spread. But what are the maximum amounts one can get?
Oh, golly, I don't know what the size of hospital sources is. I think it's a few hundreds of grams. And then you'd have to have a method of spreading them. Actually, an explosion is not all that efficient at spreading powders like that around. You need some technical knowledge to make that happen. So what it would amount to would be a large area that would have to be cleaned up somehow, and you'd probably wind up with buildings having to be demolished, that sort of thing. And there'd be a great deal of fear. As we see in some of the reporting on the pandemic, with this Omicron variant, for example, the press just goes crazy and we're all going to die. And they go crazy over radiation as well. And so there would be a lot of panic. I think the damage would be as much psychological as physical.
Right. So it's not about death, but more about the panic.
Yeah, I think so. Although you could have quite a nasty job of cleanup with a dirty bomb.
Yeah, but let's not talk about it anymore. Scary. Markéta, do you have any more questions, or are we heading to an end?
Yeah, I think we could slowly head to a wrap up.
Well, one final question then. Now, how do you see nuclear disarmament progressing in the future? Are there any hopes for nuclear weapon-free future at all, or are we just the news are just gonna stick with us?
Well, right now we're in a really bad period. Trump has upset a great many things. Like look at the difficulty we're having reconstructing the JCPOA with Iran. It's easier to break these things than it is to make them. So I think that we could move forward on disarmament, but right now I don't see that there's going to be much progress on it for at least the next year or two. I tend to be an optimist though, and I'm like, I think I see a path, and why don't you guys listen to me? So I will be writing more and keeping up the good fight, and hope that somebody does listen to me.
We're looking forward so much to reading all of that. And thank you for ending on such a positive note.
Yes, thank you very much for talking with us, and we hope that we'll be able to see some results of your work in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. And your questions were all excellent. And when I talk to young people like you, I have a lot of hope for the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.